Hi, I'm Todd Gannon, and this is the SCI-Arc Channel. I'm here tonight with Preston Scott Cohen, a professor at the Harvard GSD and principal of Preston Scott Cohen, Inc. in Cambridge. Scott, thanks for coming. I thought maybe we'd begin by talking about the architectural imagination and your submission to the U.S. Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. So tell us a little bit about your scheme.
It's an interesting problem. The task was to build what you could call an architectural fragment, because the context in which it would be understood is not complete and not planned. There wasn't a component of planning for the exhibition. The idea was that architecture would somehow spur planning. It would kind of begin with architecture and move out from it.
Right.
That architecture would be kind of the origin for rethinking what could be a plan for the city. That's kind of a polemic in itself.
You seem to have responded to that maybe a little bit more directly than some of the other schemes in taking on the not totally fleshed out plan for Detroit on the site that you're using. There's a very clever scheme, I think, in sort of offsetting the planning center toward the river. And then really the scheme becomes a kind of dialogue, not only within itself, between the sort of quotidian parking garage program and the more elaborate formalism of the roof and tower, but also between the kind of the donut and the post office, which is itself kind of doubled. The post office is two things split by a street. Your scheme is a kind of donut with the spiraling ramp. And all of that is driven by a kind of programmatic ambition for the parking garage to eventually go away as the city rebounds.
There are so many issues that are interesting in this whole endeavor, because the incompleteness and the, let's say, shrinking from an ideal and very dense urban construct that was the ambition of the original Woodward plan. All of that, this would be a building that would be something like infrastructure more than architecture, because it would be a place that could, at the beginning, serve as parking for this new waterfront park, drawing people into the city. But the idea that it could become a building, a living building, which would have all kinds of educational and performing spaces and various programs, which we thought might have something to do with the community. But that's one thing. But the other would be whether we could build these hyperboloidal thin shell structures in a phased way. It could be itself fragmentarily built, just as the Woodward plan was, so that it would be something that promises to be realized. So again, it's the inverse of the ruination. It's something that begins in a fragmentary state, which in the future will be finished. It also, of course, reflects that kind of peculiar and exciting thing that happened for architects only exciting, which is that there were magnificent buildings which in a very surreal, almost sublime way were converted through their rumination into other functions. This would be the opposite, a building that would grow into becoming, hopefully, a kind of living, monumental, civic building.
The idea of, this continuous paraboloid, being able to be built from discrete pieces. You're able to keep the slabs thin based on the geometry as opposed to the reinforcing scheme, which allows it to be built in pieces, right? Because you don't have to tension it.
And actually the physical model is built that way, and the design of how they come together is very meticulous. The physical model is a piece of architecture, really.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I mean, even more so than the design itself. I mean, because it's very abstract, the project. So actually the shafts for future accommodation of mechanical systems are owing to the way we had to assemble the model. We actually had to introduce voids so we could shift the slabs into each other. We had to slot things and leave excess openings in the model so that it was even assemblable.
Again, we get a kind of reversal where the construction of the model actually speaks to the detailing or design development of the building. You have in a very influential essay that you wrote having to do with the difference between, say, the visual impact of surfaces and the more lasting architectural implications of the core.
Right.
And so to actually design the core to be also built in stages that you kind of phase in necessary mechanical and electrical.
Right.
I think it'd be very easy to sort of nerd out on this stuff for quite a long time, but in a sense, I kind of want to, because it's so often not part of the conversation of you wouldn't expect mechanical cores and their
Right.
planning for future expansions of the building to be a big topic of conversation for a project in the Venice Biennale.
This whole thing is really interesting to me today in the cities. How the function of the the accommodation of these overscaled service programs. I mean, the same thing happened in Tel Aviv. Like, actually, a lot of what happened was just owing to the fact that trucks had to get to the building. Right. It's very interesting. I mean, it ended up, for example, forcing the crane to be positioned where it was, which determined the allocation of the panels that create the illusion of a certain kind of anamorphosis in the perspectival articulation of the envelope. So actually, you could say that those things are born in formal explorations, those facade forms, or you could say in another way that they are a testament to what happened due to the constraints. You know, it's very interesting, the tension between constraints and the will to form.
Right.
I'm very interested in that. So these things are fascinating.
There is a kind of echo of this interchange between the sort of pragmatic realities of building
Right.
buildings and architecture as a cultural pursuit. And so if today there seem to be a number of people looking at the kind of gap between the profession of architecture, the delivery of, you know, buildings, and the discipline of architecture as a kind of cultural pursuit. What I find really interesting in your work, both the writing and the building, is the way that you almost refuse that split, that the two kind of have to speak to one another in order to get the buildings going. And so,
I mean, the paradoxes existed for a long time. I mean,
Right.
you know, Khan served in service, and Palladio trying to repress any evidence of internal circulation to the servant quarters, for example, in the building. I mean, only the ceremonial sphere was expressed. There were never any internal
Right.
vertical circulative,
everything else is buried in the
communicative
poche.
systems expressed. Exactly, they're very poche. One of the things would be poche. I mean, I'm glad you touched that question. I was very interested in a long time, particularly in a project like the I-beam or the house, the Torres house, and trying to create, I know maybe this is a postmodern preoccupation, the illusion of mass, but without resorting to poche at all. It became a matter of the double surface. I mean, the kind of double-sided surface. So you know, you have the toroidal, the paradox of a torus, which is, you know, you're inside when you're outside. You know, but of course you have that same kind of thing in the minimal surface geometries, and it's kind of double toggled space. This thing that happens in the I-beam, and then what you get when you're talking about these services is either a third condition that would kind of occupy the poche, or the service zone would be one of the two.
Right.
The things built against each other. Thinning the partition between them, having it be not artificial poche, but meaningfully formed so as to make evocative the solid void relationship. I guess that was one of the things that was happening, but it ended up maybe forcing me to look at the whole question in a different way, which is that the back of house is in and of itself it's a powerful protagonist in the sequencing and structural relationships, and well, let's say the relationship the building has to the city, which is finally maybe more important than anything. One of the primary things that moves us as architects, or moves me really personally, is the way in which promenade and sequentiality is such a significant part of the experience of buildings. You know, even whether or not even they permeate a building so much, even if buildings are made of open spaces that don't articulate circulation, there is still a question of where the thresholds are, and there's still a question of where we are relative, one thing relative to another in buildings, and we're quite cognizant, even if only subliminally, of how we get where we are in the building. And sequentiality is a very powerful question to me. And it's the development of the thresholds and the ramps and the stairs and the elevator cores and the whole question of how interiors, you know, develop, that I've been, let's say, mainly focused on for many years, coming right out of those villas. And I guess what's happened with some of these larger projects, that I want this to extend itself into the city. I'm desiring that it happen at another scale, the scale between the building and the city.
I look forward to carrying on the conversation another time.
It's rare to have a conversation where someone actually goes into the specificity of a project the way you have. I really appreciated it.
Well, thanks very much. And thanks for tuning in here at the SCI-Arc Channel. We'll see you next time.